morning, Attorney Rahsaan Hall. Welcome to MCTV and thank you for accepting our invitation to discuss the crisis in the Brockton public school system. Before we delve into the topic, as this is your first appearance on MCTV show, could you please introduce yourself to our viewers?
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you for having me. My name is Rahsaan Hall. I am the president and CEO of the Urban League of Eastern Massachusetts, and I am also a Brockton resident.
Attorney Rahsaan Hall, you are the president and chief executive officer of the Urban League. Could you share a few words about this institution?
Absolutely. Around the turn of the century, black people who lived in the American South were fleeing racial violence and were looking for better opportunities and safety in northern cities. And when they arrived in northern cities like New York, like Boston, Philadelphia, Chicago, they were met with more racial violence and racial discrimination. They were also denied the employment opportunities that were available. And in some instances, some of the people who were coming north did not have the skills to be able to take advantage of the jobs that did exist. And so the Urban League came into existence around 1910 as an effort to make sure that the people who were coming from the South were trained and equipped for the employment opportunities that were available, but also to advocate for the people who were trained and equipped and had the credentials and experience for the employment opportunities that existed. And over the decades, we have continued to advocate for employment, workforce development training, and entrepreneurs, but we've also advocated for housing, health, education, and justice issues. We were one of the major organizations involved in the Civil Rights March of the 1960s. So here in Massachusetts, the Urban League of Eastern Massachusetts was founded in 1919, doing that same work. And so we operate across those areas of employment, education, health, housing, and justice. And that we do that through providing programs, but we also do that through advocacy and policy, pushing for good policies on those issues.
You are watching MCTV. Our guest today is Attorney Rahsaan Hall, President and CEO of the Urban League of Eastern Massachusetts, a resident of Brockton. Given your involvement and interest in addressing the profound crisis facing the Brockton public school system, what motivated you to initiate the community Standout event on Monday, February 26th, in front of Brockton High School?
Well, I was one of many people who were involved in coming up with the idea to do a Standout and organizing the people to get there. I did it in large part because I'm a Brockton resident, and although I don't have children in the school system, my friends and neighbors have children in the school system. But also, just as a concerned resident, I know that if our schools are underperforming or if there is disruption and violence in our schools, that impacts our community. It impacts the property value, it impacts the public safety, and so I felt that it was important to show that the community is concerned and cares about the students as well as the faculty and staff. And so myself and a few other people created a flyer and reached out to our network, and one of the things that I felt so moved by was that this was a cross-section of people in Brockton. We had white, black, different ethnicities, Cape Verdean, Haitian, Latinx. We had wealthy, we had poor, we had people from different organizations all coming together to show our support for the students. And I think it's more than just a statement of we're watching and we're paying attention and supporting you, but it's also an opportunity to organize people around these issues that are happening in our school and develop a community-based response to the issues. We don't need the National Guard to come in and deal with our children. We need the people in the community to take up the responsibility of supporting our students and faculty and staff.
Transitioning to the budget deficit in the Brockton public schools, what is your perspective as a resident of the city based on the information provided by political leaders so far?
I'm very concerned about the overspend that happened in fiscal year 22-23, as well as the shortfall that is expected for the coming school year. our community deserves so much better. And from what information has been shared, at best, it sounds like gross mismanagement. At worst, there may be some misappropriation. I think it's important for people to realize that as a community, we have to be paying attention to what's going on, and we have to hold our elected officials responsible. The school committee is responsible for approving the budgets. They are responsible for providing oversight of the school department. And if the budgets are not reconciled, we should know about it, and they should be doing something about it. Part of the reason we're in the situation that we're in right now with the disruptions in the school is because faculty and staff had to be laid off because of the overspend and the budget deficits. If there was greater oversight over that, we probably wouldn't be in this position.
6 months after Mayor Sullivan's notable statement regarding the deficit, it seems we are still in a state of stagnation. Despite a new school committee taking office on January 3rd, they are still unable to elect a vice chair. Does this situation concern you?
Absolutely. There should never be an elected body that has to make decisions that is an even split. There always needs to be an odd number so that there can be a tiebreaker. And that's the problem that we have now. We have elected a vice chair, but we cannot elect a chair because it's a 4-4 split down the middle. That's unacceptable. The city of Brockton, its residents, our students, the faculty and staff that work in our schools deserve better leadership and better guidance. And my hope is that moving forward, whether it's an amendment to the charter or just organizing within the community, that leads to a recalibration of the school committee so that we don't ever find ourselves in a situation like this. That what leads to 4 city councilor or school committee members going on their own to do a political stunt, like calling for the National Guard.
Now, regarding the controversial decision by 4 members of the school committee to petition Governor Maura Healey to deploy the National Guard to Brockton High School. Attorney Rahsaan Hall, you spoke at the school committee meeting last Tuesday. You characterized this decision as a political stunt. If so, what prompted this view?
There was a very telling moment at that special school committee meeting where one of the teachers who spoke said something to the effect of, "I don't know what your motivation was for doing this, but it worked because now everyone is here and is paying attention." And when she said that, several of the school committee members, one in particular, started clapping, as if to say, this is exactly what we wanted to happen. We made this outlandish claim that we need soldiers in our schools to bring order, and it brought the level of attention to our school that now the community is engaged and involved. But the thing that I said that night was political stunts can be powerful, but that they also have consequences. And the consequences are the narrative that gets perpetuated about our school and, more importantly, about our city. There's images of black children fighting in school being broadcast across the nation as if this is the only place that something like that ever happens, and feeds the racist narrative that our children are somehow different than any other group of children who have fights at school. It's brought a lot of a negative attention to our community. And yes, it has turned out that people are now getting engaged, but there were a lot of other ways and a lot of other steps that could be taken to get people and the community engaged.
Although Governor Healey rejected the request from the 4 members of the school committee, Brockton has been prominently featured in the media for several weeks, even on national media outlets. What are your thoughts on the long-term impact of this coverage on the city's reputation?
I think if we don't get a handle on this as a community and invest the resources and the supports and the community network to provide the services that our children need, the long-term consequences are going to be the impact on the reputation of the city of Brockton. That's going to impact housing rates. It's going to impact the ability to attract businesses to our community. That impacts the tax revenues that are used to invest in the city. So new development, keeping up with the roads, investment in community services. Those are all things that have an impact. And then additionally, the impact on the children. To have that negative stereotype hanging over your head when you're applying for colleges or when you apply for a job, that is a negative anchor on a lot of people. And so hopefully, as the community comes together and supports our kids and we can get more resources into the school, there'll be a different narrative and we can change the perception of this wonderful city.
If you just join us, you are watching MCTV. Our guest is attorney Rahsaan Hall, president and CEO of the Urban League of Eastern Massachusetts. With him, we are talking about the crisis in the Brockton public school system. During last Tuesday's school committee meeting, there was considerable discussion about new initiatives to address security issues at Brockton High School. What is your assessment of the announced measures, particularly the appointment of a security director for the high school?
It was disheartening to hear the chief's report her security recommendations. I understand that as law enforcement, there is a certain toolbox that they have. And so the tools and resources that they are going to suggest and make recommendations for are going to be very limited. None of the recommendations that she made had anything to do with addressing the underlying issues and root causes. Why is there disruption and violence in the school? What is the source of the behavior of the young people in the school? It's the lack of supervision. It's the lack of support. It's the lack of parental and community involvement. It's the lack of a culturally affirming curriculum in the schools. It's a lack of a diverse faculty that is teaching and reflecting back to the students positive images of themselves. Those are the root causes for the disruption. And instead, what she described were a set of security measures that sounded like an upgrade to a prison facility. I was very disheartened to hear it. I understand where it comes from. Yes, would it be helpful to have more surveillance in the surveillance cameras in the school? To a certain degree, yes, but do we really want to be surveilling our children? Do we want to have better locking systems on the doors to prevent, to be able to lock children into rooms or keep children safe? Those are band-aids on the problem. I would much rather make an investment or see an investment made in addressing the underlying issues, getting the types of supports to the children, the students, their families, mental health services, counseling supports, and an affirming curriculum.
Another significant development from last Tuesday's special school committee meeting at the Rahsaan School. Mike Thomas, the current superintendent, who has been on sick leave for 6 months, has been placed now on paid administrative leave. The school committee's decision was met with resistance from many community members present at the meeting. What is your opinion on this vote? What do you think about Mike Thomas' response?
It was certainly a moment of high political theatrics. I think it was a very intentional effort by Superintendent Thomas to make a public case and defend himself. I have not delved too deeply into the issue to have much of an opinion, but it's disturbing to know that we are paying Dr. Cobb as superintendent while at the same time paying Michael Thomas as superintendent when we have laid off over 100 faculty, and that speaks to management and leadership. And so I think there is a lot to be done. I think the community's engagement, people talk about just vote. Voting is so important, and it is, but it doesn't mean anything if we don't do the follow-up and work to hold elected officials accountable. And so for civic engagement organizations that are mobilizing people to vote, there's also an important civic education component that must correspond to that to ensure that that proper education about holding elected officials accountable to make sure they do their job comes alongside with that.
Attorney Rahsaan Hall, how can the city of Brockton as a community navigate collectively its way out of this crisis?
So there's certainly going to need to be an influx of financial support from the state. Hopefully there might be some federal resources that are available. But I think we are the city of champions. We have so many programs in our community that provide amazing resources and services for young people. We need to lean into and leverage those resources that exist. We also need to engage and support the people in our community. There are any number of parents who are struggling to raise their kids. What are the mentoring programs that we can initiate to engage and help support the community? The more opportunities we have to come together as a community and invest in our children and not see them as other or see them as the problem, but see them as ourselves and as a part of our community, to raise a sense of pride in being from Brockton, I think we will get better outcomes in our communities. There's also the initiative around holding the elected officials and the school accountable and responsible for the management and or mismanagement of funds, and that work needs to continue to happen. There's also that important piece of making sure that we are electing individuals with the proper background and acumen to effectively and appropriately be in these positions and provide the oversight that we need and the leadership that we need. But what it all really comes down to for me is how we as a community come together to advocate and demand these resources and provide the support to our community.
For numerous organizations providing services to youth and adolescents in Brockton, one of the main challenges is managing what they call the 3 p.m. to 8 p.m. During this period, young people are often left unsupervised as their parents, who work outside the city, are away at work.
Yeah, I mean, there's this old saying, idle hands are the devil's workshop. When young people are unsupervised, that can be a problem. I was in a conversation the other night, and this again goes to this idea of the types of investments we make in our young people, just from the perspective of physical exercise and activity. As you drive around Brockton, there are no basketball courts at any of the schools. Growing up, that was something that we could always do, is just go to the nearest high school, middle school, and play basketball. And not that basketball is a panacea or a cure-all, but it's an indicator of how we think of our kids. If we can't invest enough to have physical activity resources at the schools, what else aren't we investing in? And so there are plenty of programs out here. There's more that we need, and the ones that we do have, we need to have more funding to make sure that because that's the supplement, right? There are parents who work 2 and 3 jobs or just have one job, but it requires them to be home late. If they're working in the city of Boston, they're probably not getting home until 7, 8 o'clock. Who is supervising the children? Sometimes it is an after-school program, but a lot of times it's children sitting at home watching TV or on their phones and social media. There need to be other interventions, and I think that's important piece of the conversation, and it needs to be culturally specific. Given the large Haitian population in Brockton, the Cape Verdean population, the growing Latinx Central American population, we need culturally proficient and relevant programming as well. And not to put everyone in silos, but when we come together across those different racial and ethnic identities and become more of a community in that way, we're going to ultimately get better outcomes for our children and the community.
To end our TV show today, attorney Rahsaan Hall. The challenges facing Brockton are not unique to this city. This is a national and even international issue. Do you think it's time to reconsider our education system, particularly its funding mechanisms?
We need to rethink the way we finance education. We also need to rethink the framework that we use to build out curriculum. We need to reevaluate standardized tests. We should be getting rid of the MCAS. I think it's a problem because what it results in is teachers teaching to the test. We have taken arts and sports and physical activity out of schools because there's so much investment that is geared towards meeting the minimum proficiency standards, which I think we should have them, but the way that it is done now through MCAS is such a problem. It's a one-size-fits-all approach that is not appropriate. And then when we think about funding, we tried to address that in Massachusetts through Chapter 70, which tries to compensate for school districts that don't have a wealthy tax base. So in the town of Wellesley, the property value is much higher, and they're able to collect much more revenue from property taxes that can be invested in the school system. When you have a community like Brockton, the property value is lower, and there are more people in housing that is low income, and that impacts our tax bases and how much we can invest. But Chapter 70 tries to compensate for that by giving resources to schools with greater numbers of students who are living in poverty or living below the poverty threshold. And that's an attempt to do some of that, but there should be much more equitable funding across the state. And to your point, as a country, how do we think about financing education? That's a much broader question, but I know that it needs to be reconsidered.
Thus ends this edition of Camera Mosaic on MCTV. This edition was about the crisis created by the $18 to $20 million budget deficit in the Brockton public school system here in Massachusetts. Thank you, Attorney Rahsaan Hall, for being with us today. Attorney Hall is President and CEO of the Urban League of Eastern Massachusetts. See you next time.
Maladie sida continue à faire ravage. Li déjà touye 40,4 millions de monde dans le monde entier. Mais, avec progrès la science, maladie ça en bas code jodi a. D'après l'Organisation mondiale de la santé, en décembre 2022, il y a 39 millions de monde qui t'a vive avec sida. Les maladies a été fait commencer, c'était une sentence pour la mort. Jodi a, sida c'est une maladie chronique, tant que diabète ak tension, parce que gen remède pour contrôler sida. Médicament pour sida diminue quantité virus ak niveau activité virus a gagné dans commune. Si test HIV ou positif, ça pas veut dire ou gen sida, mais ça veut dire ou en route pour développer maladie sida. Si vous prenez remède régulièrement, virus a vient indétectable et puis il devient intransmissible. En anglais, on dit undetectable equal untransmissible. Ça veut dire you equal you. En créole, il fait indétectable égale intransmissible. So nous-mêmes, nous dit 1 égale 1. Remède a diminué le risque au gagné pour développer maladie sida. Yo pas ka détecter gène dans sang. Ça veut dire ou pas ka passer gène dans l'autre monde. Haïtiens, mes frères, y'une de l'autre, on nous bloque sida.